We were talking last time about the uniqueness of the U.S. Constitution in the United States, and I wanted to share with you this map from Wikipedia of the free and slave states. You can see the calculation of each over time in the bottom left of the map, and you can see the color coding. And of course, so what I'm trying to suggest is that one of the unique things about our founding and early America post-ratification of the Constitution was that we were, in a sense, a nation divided, with the blue states not allowing, the bright blue states not allowing slavery, and the pinkish or peach states having slavery. And of course, that ended up being one of the reasons for the Civil War. So that's another thing that's unique about us at the founding, and I'm going to assume you can see this. If you can't, you can go to Wikipedia, just type in slavery map, and the page should come up. How do I get back, Lacey? Lacey, are we back yet?
Yeah, you should see your slides now.
Okay, all right. We'll pick up now, just with a brief summary of the beginning of our discussion on the Constitution, and then we'll move forward, roughly from slide, I don't know, either 5 or 6. We're talking about the uniqueness of the Constitution, and what's critical. Not only was this map of slavery, slave and free states in terms of our uniqueness, but also, as I suggested, that all of the major countries in Europe at the time were religious states, and they were monarchies. The framers reacted negatively to that. Keep in mind that one of the reasons that many early colonists came to this country was to escape religious oppression. They didn't want a religious state, they wanted religious freedom. And so the framers, when they got around to crafting the Constitution, very clearly understood that while Americans were a religious people, the framers did not want a religious state. They did not want to replicate what they thought were the mistakes of the past that drove many early colonists to the New World. So now we're going to pick up okay, so I'm on the early colonist slide, and this kind of just repeats what I said a moment ago, so we'll move on to the next one and talk about the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was written largely by Jefferson, and there are a couple important dimensions to this document. Obviously, the first is that it was significant because it was a declaration of independence from the British Empire and the British Crown. And secondly, there's some political philosophy in the Declaration, and that political philosophy includes the discussion and elaboration of two key points. One is the idea of natural rights, and the other is the idea of the social contract. And so what Jefferson has in mind here is what previous political thinkers had been articulating in the middle to latter part of the 18th century, which is that human beings have rights naturally prior to the formation of any government. And secondly, that governments are formed through a social contract that individuals enter into in order to form both, not just a government, but also societies or communities. So that these the idea is that society and that government is a human creation rather than something that's natural. What's natural, according to Jefferson in the Declaration, is that human beings have rights, and one of those rights involves the human capacity to create society and to create governmental institutions. Key values of the Declaration then include this notion of human equality. It's not just the case that some people have rights, or quote-unquote natural rights, but that all human beings have these rights. The Declaration's most famous sentence reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, we can disagree about what exactly that means, but what's clear is that Jefferson is saying that all human beings have natural rights, or maybe just all men. Maybe he was saying just all men. Let's hope he meant all human beings, and that these rights predate any formation of society or government. And so the second idea, the idea of the social contract, is really pretty radical for the time. And by the way, it's one of the foundations of liberal political thought. The idea that governments don't exist in perpetuity, that governments are not somehow natural and always existed the way they have, but and not that God enabled kings to rule in their name, but that the people have a right to make government, to create government, and to destroy government when governments do not serve the people's needs. So he writes, and this is very much influenced by the British philosopher John Locke, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The idea of consent, very important. It's not just, oh, it's here, we have to accept it. The consent of the people is what matters in terms of making governments legitimate. That whenever any form of government is destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So this comes right out of John Locke. John Locke does not say, oh, well, if you're angry with government, you ought to have a revolution. But he's saying if over a period of time, governments become totally unreflective of the needs and aspirations of the people have a right to take action and to either change the government or to create a new one. So what the Declaration then lays out is an opposition to British rule, and in fact an opposition to rule by any central authority, at least authoritarian rule. Keep in mind the purpose of empires and colonies. What was the purpose of the American colonies? The purpose of the American colonies was the same as for any other colony, to enrich the mother country, to make England wealthier and more powerful, and to have its influence in the world expanding. And so this declaration becomes an opposition to monarchy, an opposition to British rule and domination, and each colony and state was seen as a sovereign, at that time was seen as a sovereign authority in a world where empires and small states prevailed in what we now know as nation states. But the idea here is, centralized authoritarian rule normally associated with monarchy is not, at the time, is not acceptable. So, we need to talk about the first form of government, which in the United States, which began really before they were the United States, but after the Declaration and during the war, the Articles of Confederation. This was our first form of government in what was called the New World, and at least in our part of the New World. And what kind of government was it? It was a confederation. It was a voluntary association of independent states. Previously, they were colonies, and after the independence, they were states. So they're independent states, and under the form of the Articles, the states retain most of the governmental power. The central government, the national government, was very weak, and citizens were primarily loyal to their state rather than to the new country. So the Articles did establish a government, and the Congress of the Confederation was the primary national governmental institution. So what the Articles represent is a very fragmented, a decentralized, very governmental system, a confederation of independent states, and one can see this, I think, and at least in part, as a reaction to the very concentrated governmental power that a monarchy represents. The framers weren't interested in that. The early framers, that is, those who set up the Articles of Confederation, were not interested in that. They were interested in everything but that, and in fact, they were interested in the opposite, in a confederation of independent states. The difficulty, one might add parenthetically, to interject a little bit of contemporary American politics, is that those who follow the philosophy and politics of the Tea Party tend to think that the Articles of Confederation were, in fact, the Constitution, or at least the Articles of Confederation is what they tend to advocate for. Very small government, very weak national government, very limited taxing authority. That's what the Articles did. They failed. And the failure resulted, meant that basically the political experiment with the Articles lasted for a decade. And beginning by 1789, it was clear to James Madison and to other framers that we needed a redo. We needed a different model to organize the government of the new government of the United States. So while the initial model of the Articles was a confederation, where the states had most of the power and where the national government was very weak and the execution of the laws was left to the states, the framers of our Constitution, which is our Constitution today, plus amendments, we're trying to do something very different. So the weaknesses, why was Madison concerned? Why did the framers get together in a convention in 1789? Well, here were the problems that they saw with the Articles of Confederation. First, there was no national currency. Each of the states had its own currency. And what this meant is that one state could refuse to recognize the currency of another state. So if you were, say, in Connecticut and you went across the border to Massachusetts, your money would not be recognized. It'd be worthless. Secondly, and this was a very important motivating factor for the framers, you know, we had a Revolutionary War. We declared independence from Britain. And the states, almost all of them, refused to pay their war debts. And so debts from the war kept building up. The government, the national government, such as it was under the Articles, had no mechanism for paying off the war debts. And the states refused to pay. And so this was a major concern to the framers as they worked on a new constitution. A related issue was that under the Articles of Confederation, revenues were not assured to the national government. The revenue raising, the taxing authority of the national government under the Articles of Confederation was virtually non-existent. The framers felt that they needed to address that problem in a new constitution. They came to that view. Because of the limits on revenue raising in the new government, there was totally inadequate funding for a military. And as a consequence, international problems could not be addressed, and issues of the defense of the country could not be addressed, and the status of the new country was in fact in doubt. Another weakness of the Articles of Confederation was that there were no national courts or some other kind of mechanism for resolving disputes. What you had is, 13 states, and each was essentially independent, and there was no mechanism under the Articles of Confederation strong enough and with the legitimacy to resolve disputes between states. And finally, there was a lot of unrest in the new country. Shays' Rebellion, there were problems of debt and indebtedness among farmers and large numbers of people, and this created disorder, and the national government had not being able to raise very much money and not being able to have adequate military competence, really wasn't able to deal with the problems of local and state-based and even regional rebellions. So these are some of the reasons why the framers of our Constitution came to the view that a very decentralized, state-based governmental system could no longer work. And so the framers began a convention, and the convention to begin to explore and to address the governmental problems under the Articles was not put together initially for a new governmental system, but some were ready for that. And James Madison was perhaps the premier architect of the new Constitution, and he did his homework, and it's a good lesson there. He did his homework, and he came with a draft of a new Constitution. And that became the basis for the work that the framers did in the Constitutional Convention. I'm going to skip over just briefly, the delegates to the convention were mostly upper class. They were better educated. They tended to be younger, and they worked in secrecy for the entire time the convention was in session. So what I want to do now is talk about the process involved in the Constitutional Convention and what that has to say about the Constitution. This may shock some of you. God did not write the Constitution. Men wrote the Constitution, just as Jefferson talked about in the Declaration. And it was a political document. Those people who think a Constitution is a neutral document our Constitution, any Constitution, are simply mistaken. A Constitution is a political document. And it's a political document first and foremost because in many parts of the world, in almost all parts of the world at that time, and still many parts of the world today, there is no, nations of the world, there is no Constitution. And when there is no Constitution, whoever is the political ruler can do whatever he or she wants, assuming they have the army to make that happen. A Constitution, by definition, limits governmental power because it writes down what a government is and what its powers are and what its powers are not. So a Constitution is a political document. In our case, it contained numerous compromises and was written with an eye toward ratification. The framers weren't interested in just political theory. They needed to come up with a political document that could be ratified by the states. And if it was not ratified by the states, it would not be adopted as the new governmental order for the United States. So at the Constitutional Convention, there were basically two factions. One was the anti-nationalists, that is those people who wanted minimal reforms in the Articles of Confederation and saw the states and the independence of the states and their state governments as the most critical fact in what should be the new government, as opposed to the strong nationalists who were the majority. That is, the majority of the framers, the majority of the men who came to the convention had had enough of the Articles. And the fundamental purpose of the Constitutional Convention from their point of view was to create a much stronger national government. I know that runs against what some people today think the Constitution was, but that is what the Constitution was at the time. They were interested in a stronger national government, not a tyrannical national government, but a much stronger national government than what the Articles allowed. And so one of the first problems, one of the first issues that the framers needed to address was who was going to be represented and how in the new government and in its governmental institutions. And basically two plans were presented, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. These were plans for representation in the legislative branch, which we now call Congress. The New Jersey plan, keep in mind, New Jersey is a small state. The New Jersey plan was that each state should be represented equally. So there are 13 states. Each state should get the same number of votes. The Virginia plan took a different perspective. Keep in mind, Virginia was one of the largest, if not the largest, state in terms of population. So what the Virginia plan said is no. We don't want each state to have the same number of representatives because there are a lot more people in some states than others, and we should be representing people in this new government. And so out of this difference of opinion about representation came a political compromise. It's often called the Great Compromise. And this Great Compromise is important, not just in and of itself, as a way to understand how representation in American national government was created, but it also created a model for the way American politics has often been done. So you have 2 points of view. You have representation by population, representation by state. And the model, the compromise that was developed said, okay, both sides can get what they want. It's a win-win. We don't have a situation where one side wins and one side loses. What we have is we'll do both. So the Virginia plan says we're going to represent people by population. The larger the population in a state, the greater the number of representatives. The New Jersey plan, equal state representation. So the compromise says, okay, we'll just have two bodies of Congress. One body of Congress will be represented by population. The greater the population in the state, the more representation it will have. And the other body in the Senate will have equal representation for each state. So what you have is a quote-unquote win-win situation. The political compromise was each side wins. Each side got what it wanted, except there was a problem. One that would continue to haunt the new government. And that's the problem of slavery. How do you count, if at all, slaves in the determination of representation in the House of Representatives, where that's done by population? So that was a problem. Do they count as 0 people? Do they count as a full people, even though they have no political rights? What do we do with this? And so out of this problem evolved the 3/5 compromise. Simply put, and this was in the original Constitution, simply put, the 3/5 compromise provided that representation in the House of Representatives for slave-holding states was such that every adult male slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person. So that was the political compromise that did two things. First of all, it provided an incentive for slave states in the short run to hold and import more slaves because they get more political power, more representation in the Congress. And second, it meant that even initially, the slave states' population would lead to greater representation than of what voters actually existed at the time, because slaves, of course, couldn't vote. So why did this happen? The answer is pretty simple. That is, the slave states would not agree to support the new Constitution unless a provision was made that would allow them additional representation for adult male slaves. And so that is another key, if very uncomfortable for us today, political compromise in the formation and ratification of the new Constitution. Why do constitutions matter? I've already suggested this. Constitutions, by definition, limit governmental power. There weren't many constitutions back in 1789. Certainly not many in Europe, and not many anywhere else. And so the very idea of a constitution itself is one of the major contributions of our framers. The idea that you can write down, that men and women, it was men at the time, can write down specifically, or at least generally, what governments can and cannot do, is a unique contribution of our Constitution. It also has created over our history the myth of a founding document and made our political culture legalistic, more legalistic than many others. And some might see this as a bad thing, others might see this as a very positive thing. The idea that there are rules that are written down by which people in politics and government have to follow those rules. Why have a constitution at all? Because of the experience that Americans had at the time about monarchy, and specifically King George III. They feared a king. They feared concentrated governmental power. They understood concentrated power to be tyranny, and they wanted to create a governmental system that would prevent the excessive concentration of governmental power. And so that was one of the formative intents of the framers. So the preamble of the Constitution, I think, is pretty important. And from my point of view, it challenges the way we think about American government today. Our country, probably more than any other country on earth, tends to the view, our political culture tends to the view that individual rights predominate. They're the most important thing, the rights of the individual. And if you go back to Jefferson and the Declaration, clearly this notion of natural rights, the idea that rights exist prior to any formation of government, is an important part of American political culture. But I ask you to note and pay attention to the preamble to the Constitution, because the preamble doesn't really talk about rights. It talks about the public purpose of the Constitution of the United States and the public purpose of our government. And here's the quote. You can read it. "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." This is a reference to the Articles of Confederation, where there was no union. "To establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare." All of these things are shared, common, national, public purposes. And finally, "and secure the blessings of liberty." But note this language. Secure the blessings of liberty, not just for ourselves, but for our posterity, for those who follow us, meaning that liberty isn't simply about an individual's rights, that liberty has a public and historical dimension to it, that it is a governmental system that endures over time. "Do ordain and establish this Constitution." So there's not a lot in here about individual rights as the purpose of national government. There's a lot in here about correcting the imperfections and undoing the imperfections of the Articles and establishing national governmental purposes. Again, not currently a particularly popular way of thinking about the Constitution in some circles today, but the fact remains this is the preamble that the framers wrote, and these are the purposes to which they committed themselves. So I think I'm going to stop here, and next time we'll talk about the principles of the Constitution, starting with the separation of powers, checks and balances, and the federal system. If you have questions, I hope you're able to access this recording online, and and that we'll pick up next time with a discussion of constitutional principles.